Hey everyone. Ever been in that situation like where you're hanging out with a friend and suddenly things feel a little different, a little bit charged?
Oh, yeah. I think most of us have been there at some point or another. It's a pretty universal experience, wouldn't you say?
Totally. We all have those moments where we're like, wait, is this just friendship? Or is this something more?
Right, like that classic friend zone dilemma. It's a topic that always sparks a lot of debate and discussion.
For sure. And to really get into the nitty-gritty of it, we're going to be taking a deep dive into this episode of the podcast, Friend Zone or More, exploring the timeline of feelings.
Sounds juicy. I'm curious to hear what they have to say about that whole timeline of feelings thing. It's not like there's a set schedule for when feelings develop, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
different for everyone. And that's what makes it so fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really unpack all the different factors that can influence that transition from just friends to maybe something more.
Definitely. There's so much to consider, right? Like how close you are as friends, if there's any attraction there, and even just timing in life. All of those things play a role.
Absolutely. It's like a whole recipe for love, or at least for figuring out if there's a potential for love in a friendship.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
A recipe for love.
So let's start with that first ingredient, emotional closeness. The podcast made this point about how when you're really close friends with someone, like sharing all your secrets and dreams, it can sometimes blur the lines between friendship and something more romantic. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, when you think about it, you're already building this deep connection with someone, you're sharing your vulnerabilities, being there for each other. It's kind of like a breeding ground for deeper feelings to develop.
Exactly. Like you're already emotionally invested in each other's lives. And the podcast even mentioned that there's actual research suggesting that the more emotional closeness there is in a friendship, the more likely it is that romantic feelings will develop.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. It's like science is backing up that whole friends first approach to relationships.
Right. And think about it, those moments when you share something really personal with a friend, something you wouldn't tell just anyone, it creates this new level of intimacy, almost like a unspoken bond. Have you ever had an experience like that where sharing something deep with a friend kind of changed the dynamic of the relationship, even if just a little?
Oh, totally. I think we've all had those moments where you're like, wow, I just shared something super personal with this person, and now I feel closer to them in a way I didn't before.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't even explain it, it's just a feeling. But closeness alone doesn't always mean a friendship is destined to become something more right. There's got to be something else in that recipe for love.
Definitely. That's where things get even more complicated because the next ingredient we have to throw in is attraction. And this is where the whole friend zone thing can get really tricky.
Oh, for sure. Especially because, like the podcast pointed out, attraction isn't always mutual.
Exactly. You could have two friends who are super close, share everything, but one of them feels that spark while the other doesn't. And that can create all sorts of tension and awkwardness.
No kidding. It's like navigating a minefield of feelings. So how do you even begin to define when a friendship crosses that line and becomes something more? Like, is there an official rule book for this stuff?
I wish there were. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. The term friend zone itself is kind of vague and can mean different things to different people. But I guess at its core, it's about that mismatch in feelings. One person wants more than friendship, while the other is happy keeping things platonic.
Right. And that can make things super complicated, especially when you've got this whole history of friendship and maybe even some unspoken feelings floating around.
Precisely. And to make matters even more complex, attraction isn't just about physical attraction, right? It's also about that emotional connection, that sense of understanding and being understood that we were talking about earlier.
Totally. It's like that click you feel with someone where you just get each other on a deeper level. And
Mhm.
sometimes those feelings can sneak up on you, especially in the context of a close friendship. One minute you're laughing over inside jokes, the next you're wondering if maybe there's something more to it.
Exactly. It often happens gradually, you know? It's not like a light switch flips on and suddenly you're head over heels. It's this evolution of feelings fueled by shared experiences, growing intimacy, and probably a little bit of biology thrown in there too.
Fascinating. So we've got emotional closeness and attraction as the first two ingredients in our recipe for love. But what's the final ingredient? What really tips the scales?
Ah, that's the tricky part, isn't it? The final ingredient, and maybe the most unpredictable one, is timing.
Timing. Okay, so like being single at the same time, or is it more than that?
Yeah, it's definitely part of it, but it's really more about life circumstances, shared experiences, those moments that can either bring you closer to someone or, push you apart. Remember that example from the podcast about the two friends who were both going through breakups at the same time?
Oh, right. Yeah, they were both nursing broken hearts, leaned on each other for support, and ended up falling for each other.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, like, were those feelings already there under the surface, or did going through that experience together, like, act as a catalyst?
That's a great question. It really highlights the power of shared experiences, especially when there are a lot of emotions involved. Think about it. You're both vulnerable. You're offering each other comfort and understanding, and suddenly that platonic bond takes on a whole new meaning.
It's like all of a sudden you're seeing each other in a different light,
Right.
right? Like you're not just friends anymore.
Yeah.
You're sharing this intense emotional experience together.
Exactly. And it can really accelerate those feelings, those shared experiences, those moments of intense connection. They can really fast forward the development of deeper feelings, sometimes even catching people off guard.
So it's not just about time passing, it's about what you're going through during that time, right?
Mhm.
Like those big moments, those turning points that change the dynamic of a friendship.
Mm.
And I guess those moments can be good or bad. It doesn't have to be a heartbreak. It could be celebrating a big win together, going on an adventure, or even just navigating a tough time in your lives.
Exactly. Any experience that brings you closer to someone, that deepens that bond, that makes you understand each other better, it all has the potential to tip the scales. And the podcast actually has some awesome stories from listeners that really illustrated this point.
Oh, yeah, the listener stories. Those were really, what were some of the ones that stuck out to you?
Well, one listener talked about how they had been friends with this person for years, but it wasn't until they went on a trip together that things changed romantically. Being away from their normal routines, experiencing new things together, it just sparked something they hadn't felt before.
It's like that change of scenery can change everything. You're outside of your comfort zone, seeing each other in a new light, letting your guard down a little. And that definitely makes sense for all those vacation romances we hear about. But you're right, it doesn't have to be some big adventure. Even small everyday moments can have a big impact. I remember one of the listeners mentioned how they started developing feelings for a friend after they started having these deep late night conversations. It was like those intimate moments of sharing really shifted things for them.
That's so true. It shows how important communication and vulnerability are in these situations. Really opening up to each other and sharing those deeper thoughts and feelings. Another listener talked about realizing they had feelings for a friend after that friend went out of their way to help them during a rough time.
It's those acts of service. When someone shows you they care, it can really make you see them in a new way. So are we saying that every close friendship is like a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode into romance? That seems a bit dramatic, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. It's true that a lot of close friendships have that potential, but it's definitely not a guaranteed outcome. And just because one person starts to have feelings doesn't mean the other person will feel the same way. That's where things can get really tricky, especially if you're trying to protect the friendship.
Right. You don't want to ruin a good thing by making a move that's not welcome or by putting too much pressure on the friendship. So how do you navigate that? How do you figure out if those feelings are mutual without messing things up?
That is the question, isn't it? Like, how do you decipher those signals without making things awkward?
Exactly. Like you're looking for hints, but you don't want to read too much into things and freak them out.
Right. And the podcast really stressed how important it is to communicate in these situations. If you're starting to catch feelings for a friend, having that open and honest conversation, even though it can be scary, is super important.
Oh, totally. Those conversations can be terrifying.
Huh?
But I guess avoiding the conversation could actually be even riskier, right? Like what if you end up resenting them or things get misconstrued down the road?
Yeah, exactly. Keeping your feelings bottled up can create so much unnecessary drama and could even damage the friendship. And honestly, even if the feelings are mutual and you decide to take that leap from friends to something more, it's not always going to be easy.
So true. It's like you're starting a new relationship with a whole lot of history already there.
Mm.
I mean, that shared history can be amazing, but it can also complicate things.
Hmm.
What are some of the things people should watch out for when they're trying to transition from friends to something more?
Well, the podcast talked about setting boundaries and expectations. Just because you are awesome friends doesn't automatically mean you'll be a perfect couple. You're entering this whole new dynamic, and it takes time to adjust.
It's like learning a new dance with someone you've only ever walked beside. Their moves. But moving together in this new way takes practice and communication. And what happens if things don't work out romantically? Is it possible to go back to being just friends?
That's a really good question. It can be tough. Sometimes it's possible to salvage the friendship, but it takes a lot of maturity, understanding, and letting go of any lingering romantic feelings. But sometimes the damage is too much, and the friendship might not survive the change.
Wow. It's a real gamble, with no guarantees either way, whether you stay friends or try for romance. So after all this, is there any way to tell when a friendship might blossom into something more? Like, is there a secret formula we can follow?
I wish. But unfortunately, as we've learned, there's no magic formula or timeline. It's this crazy mix of personalities, experiences, and circumstances. It's what makes relationships so complicated, but also so interesting, right?
Definitely. And even though we didn't get a crystal ball to predict the future of our friendships, this deep dive has given us so much to think about.
For sure. We've covered so much: emotional closeness, attraction timing, shared experiences, and that tricky transition from friends to maybe something more.
And while we can't control what happens, I think the biggest takeaway is the awareness we've gained. Now we can go into our friendships with more sensitivity and maybe even a little more intention.
Exactly. We're more in tune with those subtle shifts in feelings and better equipped to deal with whatever comes up.
So no matter what happens, we're going into it with our eyes wide open. Well said. Well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into the oh-so-mysterious and sometimes messy world of the friend zone.
It's been a fun ride.
It really has. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this journey of exploration. Until next time, keep those friendships strong, keep those conversations open, and who knows, maybe you'll discover that the friend zone is just the beginning of something even more amazing.